All right. So welcome. My name is Rebecca Murray. I originally come from the U.S. I have a background in biomechanics and biomedical engineering, but I've participated in, I think, a decent level of sport quite often. And so a lot of these advanced studies and advanced methods, I've actually been the person going through the training. So it's kind of interesting to now read about it and be able to lecture about a couple different things. But so this is lecture 2 of SPE 211, and I'm taking over for Jim because Jim's in Japan right now, just filling in. So bear with me a little bit if the slides are a bit funny and I try to figure out what they mean, because they've been prepared last year by Tim Hazelwood. So I'm going to sit over here and move the slides. Okay, so today is primarily going to be about absolute body size as the first part of the lecture. And that particularly means your mass and your height. So how much you weigh and how tall you are. And just how those parameters are correlated, how they go together with your sporting ability. So can you kind of predict how well a person can be at certain sports based on their absolute body size? So going along with the absolute body size is this idea called morphological optimization. It's the process by which the ideal body size and shape for a particular sport are selected or modified. So it's trying to say, okay, this person's really tall and quite heavy. What could we use them for? One of the first things I would think of is, because I'm American, professional football. So football players typically have a high mass because if you hit them, they don't bounce away. They can tackle people a bit more. It's based on collision. Also, a more Australian example would be rugby. For the people in the scrum, they need to have a pretty high body mass so they're not pushed around easily. But there's also the other end of the scale. You might want to be small and skinny, particularly like marathon runners. So it's trying to take evaluates a person's height and mass and trying to figure out what kind of sports would be optimized for them. And on the other side of that is also trying to optimize the body for particular sports. So here is the football example. If you see this guy here in number 58 and 90, they're big guys. They have very muscular structures, very tall. And so they're designed to be fast and have a lot of mass. And so that way they get a bunch of momentum built up and inertia, so when they hit somebody, you don't bounce off. This is quite an interesting photo because you would look at that and you're wondering which is the best for health and performance, and you'd look at the left one and think, oh, that can't be too healthy. He looks really skinny. And then the sprinter is quite muscular and it goes more along the idea of what you might think of as healthy, but it's not necessarily the best for whatever they're trying to do. So today we'll be talking about why those body types are optimized for that particular event they're doing, because they're in the same sport, but even within sports, the bodies are optimized for the different events or tasks they have to do, even within the same team. In rugby, the people on the wing, I don't know if I'm using the right term, the outside, they are often smaller and quicker, whereas the people in the scrum are heavier. Gymnastics is a good example. They can contort their bodies in lots of ways. They have to be able to spin quickly, and to be able to spin, you have to have a moment of inertia that's quite close to your center, so that's also quite important that you can get angular velocity very quickly. You have to be strong enough to hold yourself in those positions and quick enough to be able to move your body in those ways. So they have a particular body shape that is optimized for that sport. High jumpers are quite a nice example of how height has really influenced how much they can jump. We'll actually go into more detail talking about how the center of mass helps high jumpers. So the taller you are, the higher you can jump. So the principles of this morphological optimization are that successful athletes are characterized by a mix of physiological, psychological, and anthropometric qualities. And so breaking that up, physiological are like the like heart rate, your different, and psychological are your ability to withstand the different mental pressures of the sort, staying focused, and anthropometric are just your general like height and mass qualities. And because it's competitive, they're kind of relating this to a Darwinist philosophy that as you go up in the elite levels and tiers of sport, only the fittest will survive. So when you're a child and you're just playing in the basic one, you got all different body types in. But then as you move up to state or then regional and then national levels, you're gonna get the people that are gonna drop out. And so the body types that aren't optimized for that are more likely to fall out. And so what you'll see is that there is this kind of fittest survive, and especially in certain sports, this is driving the difference between sports. So like NBA players are quite tall, and it's driving that all the tall players are playing, and quite small people are still being jockeys. And so it's separating the good people from the great people, and a lot of this can, they're saying, be correlated to your absolute body size. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this. So where the body size and shape are important, this is called morphological optimization. Genetics, training, supplements, drugs, changes the game, a space of rules. So they're going for the Aussie football example. Now they're having longer breaks, but shorter periods of burst. And so this has allowed bigger players to become more of an important role, which before, because it was more continuous, it had more to do with being able to have endurance. And so endurance, and we'll get to the kind of physics behind it in a moment of why being smaller really helps your endurance. But since they're having longer breaks, it allows for larger players to not be so disadvantaged, and so they're seeing a change in the body type that is optimized for the AFL. And one of the big parts about this is the last sentence there. The tendency in sport in general has been toward more homogeneous physiques within sports and heterogeneous physiques between sports. So what all that's saying is that it's within the same sport, say basketball, you're getting people that are taller and leaner, and it's going more towards a specific direction in one sport. But you compare that sport to marathon runners, and they're very small and thin, and so you're getting very optimized, very small windows of body sizes in particular sports, and that difference between the sports is getting bigger. So between the runners and between the basketball players, that difference between them is getting bigger, but within the same sport, it's getting smaller. You're getting very optimized people for that same sport. This is quite a hard side to read, but it's fairly interesting in what it's trying to cover. So this is trying to, the body size in general doesn't explain why you're better at a particular sport. This slide is trying to go a little bit further and to tell you why the size makes a difference in that sport. So what they've been able to see is that, so your body surface area has been shown to increase faster than your height, which makes sense. So if you think of your height, it's just a linear measurement, just a line. And your surface area is like if you'd wrap toilet paper around you. Every part of that line, as you go down, you're going to get more surface area compared to that line. And so body surface area increases faster than height. And the same thing for weight. It's the exact same concept. So both of those increase more than your height, but they're correlated, so they're connected. And then if you go into your body surface area per kilogram of weight, this correlates negatively. So if you, your body surface area per kilogram goes down as you get taller. So this is important, especially for runners or anything that has to do with endurance. So the smaller you are, the lower your body surface area to body weight is. And that at first seems a bit convoluted, doesn't make sense. But as soon as you think about it as a heat dissipation, so if you're enduring, you have to be able to take in a lot of oxygen, and as you are trying to keep going, you have to get rid of all the heat that you're producing as you're doing power. And if you have more surface area, your heat can dissipate faster. And so smaller people have an advantage here. Whereas if you have more body mass, you're taking it in, you can actually hold in the heat more, which is a big disadvantage if you're trying to do endurance sports. But for power things that aren't prolonged, it becomes an advantage to have more mass because you have more muscle fiber and you can run more. You can run stronger, more powerfully. So the surface area to body weight is important for a heat dissipation reason. So getting rid of and sweating out all the energy you've been building up. And so some of the other interesting ones are the ability to accelerate external objects. That increases as you get taller. And that has mainly to do with lever arms. So if you're a thrower, let's say, you have an object out in your hand, your length to your arm is going to be longer. And that gives you a mechanical advantage because if you're trying to throw, it allows you to get a longer distance for it to be. And so you get a lot of extra power behind the same amount of, that just produces a mechanical advantage. So if you put the exact same power in as from a tall person compared to a short person, just having that lever arm be longer will make you throw it much further. So it's proportionally further. Now, the ability to accelerate own body is also interesting. It's much easier to do that for a smaller person. They have less mass to carry, so it takes less energy to take off. So then lifting your own body weight, also if you're smaller, you don't have as much work to do to lift your own. And they say running at constant speed on a level ground is equal for taller, short people. And running uphill, size is a disadvantage because you got more mass to go up the hill. Same as biking up a hill. If you have more mass, it's a disadvantage to have to go up because you have to work harder to get up. Now, if you're running down a hill, your mass actually helps you because it helps drive you down the hill, and also on a bike. Long jump, no influence, and high jump, again, it's advantage to be tall. So swimmers are a good example of optimized body shape, especially Michael Phelps. He had big hands and big feet to help him propel. He also has broad shoulders, and they're quite mesomorphic, which we'll talk about in the second slide. And women also are very much taller than the standard population and more muscle mass. So now one of the things that people like to do to try to distinguish athletes from other categories is to try to compare them to what they call a source population. Now, a source population is just wherever you can pull the athlete from. So let's say if you're in Darwin, your source population would be the whole population of Darwin. You have that entire population in order to be able to pick your athletes from. And so what they try to do to see how athletes vary is they take the general data from that source population and compare what the athletes are in comparison. So one of the examples they show here are the rowers. So they're comparing the rowers in the US from 18 to 35-year-old males. They were at 174.1 centimeters. And then if you compare it to, I got this a bit backwards. So basically all they're saying is that rowers are taller. It gives them a mechanical advantage in the lever arm. And in Australia, the rowers were 190 centimeters compared to the source population of 178 centimeters. This is also very true for basketball, and basketball is one of the biggest examples of size optimization out there. In the recent years, it's one of the most dramatic examples going from for morphological optimization in terms of size. The height has gotten taller and taller. Here's showing rugby ability levels and how the height and the mass has changed. What's kind of unique here is the fact, so you go from the bottom level, club level being the lowest, and you see this mesomorphy, which we'll talk about later, but it's in general the amount of muscle you have compared to your body, like how strong you are, how powerful. That's what it tries to assess. And you can see it just increases as you go steadily up the levels. But if you look at stature, the height of the person really only increased from the club level to the state level, and then it stayed kind of constant here. So what you see is the difference is that here the mass just continually increases upwards, and so what it sees is that the people stay about the same height after they reach the state level, but the mass, how much they weigh, how much muscle they have in them, increases steadily. And so to survive in rugby, you need to get stronger as you go up in the level. That's what I would say from that. This one's a quite an interesting one about Olympic shot putters. I think I have an example here. So shot putters are known for being probably a bit larger than the average person, but this is showing how shot put population has changed over time. So if you go from the 1920s, you have not too much of a difference. So right here you got mass, so how much they weigh. So 80 to 90, I mean, that was a bit higher than probably a standard population at the time. But if you look over time, especially in the 60s to the 90s, you just see this really large increase where there is still this band in the 80 to 90, but most of the shot putters are now over 100 kilograms. So that's actually quite large. And you even have some 150, 160 level. These are quite massive individuals. And the benefit of having mass in shot put is if you can get that mass accelerated, once you do, you can put a lot of that power behind the throw, and so it helps you throw the object in your hand. And so that mass behind that can be transferred to the object in their hand, and so it is a benefit to them. And so what you've seen as this is the optimization of the body shape over time. Now, it also shows that you don't have to be on that curve to be good. You can also be the standard body type and have good technique and work hard, and you can get there, but it does help to get to the optimized body shape. So one of the ways of showing how how two variables compare. So when I say variables, especially in this part of the lecture, it's something you can measure. Here, it's mass, let's say your body weight, and height. And so what you can see is that these are plotted, so you got mass on your y-axis and height on your x-axis. And what they did is they plotted the source population. So if you would see 90% of people, let's keep continuing on with the Darwin example. If this is 90% of the population of Darwin, and you would take the marathoners, this would be where the marathoners fit compared to the source population. And then if you look and see where these overlap, this gives you a stat they call the BOZ, the bivariate overlap zone. And this overlap zone gives you an idea of how different the marathoners are to the source population. Or if this wasn't marathoners, the shot putters, or whatever sport population you're trying to compare to the whole base comparison, this bivariate overlap zone will tell you that. Now, it does go, so as you move further away, so imagine the marathoners move down here, you'll have a much smaller zone, and that'll show that your marathoners are more different from the source population. So a decreasing BOZ score means that your population is more optimized. It's more different from your source population. This is continuing on the same trend. It's showing how your source population has changed from the 1900s until 2000. So basically what it's showing is that in this time from 1900, you had first a source population that fit into this ellipse, but over time people grew taller, so it's moved to the right, and they've also grown heavier, it's moved up. And so this oval has now moved over here. And the other thing this shows is how the marathoners have changed in that time. So in the 20s, they were here, and then 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Basically what this shows is that the marathon population stayed in a very small window. It did move up a little bit in height, but 4 centimeters compared to probably 10 centimeters of the population. And it stayed extremely similar in the mass. Like, the mass has not changed, even though their height has. So what this is showing is that marathoners are becoming taller, very little bit, but still less than the source population. And they are maintaining a very low body mass. And so this is very particular and optimized for the endurance that they have to do. So they have less surface area to mass ratio, and so they can dissipate heat more. And it's showing how they've optimized themselves. And over time, where they've stayed very similar, the population has grown away from them. So they're much different from the population than they were back in the 20s. Here's some examples of some of the body types of marathoners. And you can just see they're much smaller than the normal population, but they have quite good muscle mass. So this is showing data on over 12,000 male athletes from 21 different sports. And basically, you got your stature over here, so your height, and you got your mass over here. The interesting thing about here is it gives you an Oz score, which you can read about in your in the textbook, and the BOZ score, which is the combined one. And so, basically what you need to know is the lower the Oz score, the more different this value is from the source population. So if you're looking down here, 7, this is the lowest score by far. And so the population, NBA, has a mean of 200. This is by far, this is the most different from the source population. And this again goes with what I was saying earlier about the NBA being the most optimized sport, or one of the most optimized sports. And in height, it for sure is, of these analyzed. But if you go down through the list, the bigger the number is, the more the overlap. So let's say soccer, you got 43.7% overlap. That means that the population in soccer and the source population is very similar, so you don't see much difference. But that goes along with the different positions available in soccer. Not everyone has the same body type. If you go over to mass, what you can see is in boxing, very small overlap. That's because, especially with this is heavyweight boxing, they're really big, really strong. Muscle mass weighs more than just typical fatty tissue, and so they weigh a lot more, and it's heavyweight or in a specific category, so it doesn't have much standard deviation, and therefore there is quite a big difference from the source population. And then if you can take both, the BOS score. BOS combines both the stature, the height, and the mass, and it gives you it combines both of the variables and gives you a one number value for how different that is from the population. So the heavyweight boxers, I would say, are the most different from the source population, followed by NBA and the rugby forwards, because they're in the scrums. So and rowing, those are the heavyweight rowers. So you can see the lower the number, the more specialized they are. It doesn't mean that other positions or other sports aren't specialized, because rugby, you see this difference where the backs are 28.1 overlap, whereas the forwards are 9.5. So there is specialization even within the same sport. So you can be very closer to the source population, doesn't mean that you're not specialized. And here's the same table except for female athletes. It has less sports compared and much less data points. Here you only see about 250 female athletes. On this one, you get over 12,000 male athletes. But that said, almost 8,000 come from the NFL and 1,500 come from the NBA. Other than that, there's not as many people. But the female athletes, much less followed, much less reported. You got much less data to work with. But you can still see the specialization in the sports. But the other thing you can see here, the Oz scores, none of them are a 1 or a 5. The lowest number you get is like a 15 for volleyball. They're much taller than the rest. But they're not as different from the source population as the male sports are. And if you see here, you got the same conclusion. And then with the BOS, you have that as well. So some of the most specialized sports would be netball. Netball is quite tall for the sport, and I think their mass is a bit heavier, but not too much. That's just to get power. So there's a couple different theories on how this optimization of your body size can go. One of the theories is called open-ended optimization. It's open-ended means it can continue and continue to go further and further. So what this is saying is that this body market, and they talk about it like the size of your body and your source population. They refer to it like a market, like an economic market, where sports clubs and things will go and try to pick people out like they're part of a commodity market, which is quite an interesting analogy. And what they're saying is this population, this market is growing because as globalization happens, people don't just stick to the one region to get their market. So NBA, just because I know it really well, in 90s, there was only about 5% of people that were foreign born, like late 1990s. And then 4 or 5 years later, it jumped to 10%. And those extra people were always taller and had more mass. And so they were taking the people from the European market and from the foreign markets that are bigger and stronger. And they're taking the players that are optimized for that position because they now have a larger market. And so this open-ended is just trying to say that when athletes get bigger and bigger, it can just continue to get more and more extreme. And this has been seen in the NFL. And you can just see how the mass and the height just continues to grow in these body markets. And what it leads to is it places demands on the body market that leads to extreme distortions and globalization of sport. The players' salaries also increase, and then the clubs try to poach these different body types from other sports. So let's say somebody's playing AFL and they actually look like they might be a good cricketer, they'll go try to poach them based off of their body type. And so this will probably be discussed a bit later. But here's a good example of body optimization. Sumo wrestlers have a massive mass, and that's because of inertia. They don't want to be pushed out of the ring, and so the more mass they have, the harder it is to knock them over. And the little guy going up against the big guy doesn't have much of a chance, I wouldn't say. Here you're looking at another graph of the mass of an individual over here and the year. And this is for the National Football League, so American football. And what you see is little open dots, that's for quarterbacks, and the filled in dots, it's for tackles. And as you can see through the years, you can just see a quite steady increase. So this is shown with the years, the mass has been steadily increasing. But what's not shown here is where it's true that the source population, the mass has increased, the rate at which it's increased has been very different. So the source population, it would increase probably like this, where it would go much slower. But what you're seeing is this body optimization, and the players get more and more massive, like bigger and bigger, so they can sustain the hits. And people are getting specialized, and it's extremely shown in the mass, not as thoroughly as it's shown in the height, but very specialized and getting heavier. Now, relative optimization is the second theory of optimization. It's when the body size of a sport group may differ from what the source population is, but changes over time in step with the source population. So rather than the previous one, where open-ended, it just gets bigger and bigger at a much different rate than the source population, this is saying that you get optimization, but it changes very close to how the source population changes. So one of the things it talks about is how rugby players are consistently taller than the source population. But that discrepancy, that they're taller, but that change, the difference between the rugby population and the source has stayed the same. So as the population has gotten bigger, so has rugby, but it's not this extreme push towards heavier or taller rugby players. So here's a cyclist, an indoor cyclist. If you have the pursuit cyclists especially, there's been a big push towards cyclists having very similar mass and size. So as they're going in the same direction, the drag behind them stays more similar, and it's much better. So there's been a trend in this population. It follows the same as the source population, but it continues. It's more steady. So if you would look at the overlap, it would be the standard deviation would be much less in the cyclist population than the source population. And soccer also, they're getting bigger and taller, but they're not necessarily going at the extreme pace of NFL and NBA are. And then the third theory, the last one they talked about, is absolute optimization. It occurs when the body size of the sport group does not change despite secular changes in the body size of the source population. Now, this is exactly what was talked about when I showed you the graph on the marathon runners, where the source population has grown in both mass and height, whereas the marathoners really stayed in the same location. And so it did not, the height and mass of marathoners stayed very close, and then the source population grew like 10, 15, 20 centimeters, and they just stayed where they were. And this has also been found in jockeys. So you just see, they've always been smaller than the source population, but their size, even though the source population is getting taller and bigger, the size of the jockey has stayed very similar. And jockeys want to be small because the more mass they have, the more resistance it is for, and more work the horse has to do. And also, the more mass and the taller they are, the more air resistance they'll cause. So that'll also slow down the horse. And so you want a jockey that is quite small, and so their stature has stayed very similar. So this is another example of the same topic. What you can see is that from 1945 to 1995, so that's your x-axis, a year, and the average height of the male divers, so jumping off a diving board into the water in the pool, you get very little increase in height, even though the source population, I think I remember reading it was, we grow 1 centimeter every 10 years in general, and we grow about 1 kilogram every 10 years. And if you see that from 1945 to 1995, that should be 50 centimeters in height growth, but, or sorry, 5 centimeters. But what you see is maybe 1. So they're not growing at the same rate as the population. So what this is saying is the body size and shape of sports people are becoming more differentiated. So for particular sports, you're getting the people to have very particular sizes and shapes. And they're getting more similar within the same sport and more different between sports. So even though skating is, like there's figure skating and speed skating, there's a quite different morphological optimization happening there. In speed skating, you need more muscle mass in your thighs and to get power to push off. Whereas in figure skating, you do need the power to do the jumps, but you can't be too big. You have to be able to do the quick angular acceleration. And so you're going to have different specializations. Even though it's skating, you still have different morphological adaptations. Now, one of the consequences of these body optimizations is what they're calling a body drain in sports. It's kind of odd to think of something called a body drain, but they talk about something called a brain drain in academics. Basically what they're saying is that professional clubs that have a lot of money, spend a lot of money to go try to find the best person for the job, and they will go to new countries, new areas to try to find the best person. So there's been a big uptake in marathon runners that come from Africa, and especially certain nations in Africa. And so people will go into those countries and try to get people from those countries to move to there so they can compete for their team. Another example is soccer. And so what they have shown, so 50% of all World Cup players were playing for the wealthy countries. So you're seeing a lot of the best players and the most optimized players going to the people with the most money. So if you can pay them more, they'll go there because they can get more money. But it makes, like, if you're a poor country, you're going to get body drain. It means your players are going to go play for the wealthy countries. And so that's where you get the body drain. Oh, I like the example of the World Cup here. In 1999 Rugby World Cup, there were enough New Zealanders playing for various countries to field 2 extra teams. So obviously, people in New Zealand are considered good at rugby, and so they started playing for other countries because they were being paid to play there. Or they got citizenship in the other countries. So the globalization of sport is even more pronounced in free sports markets, such as the NBA. So in 1999, I've kind of forewarned about this one. In 1999, 4.4% of players were foreign origin, but that increased to 9% just 3 years later. There was huge increase in foreign talent in the NBA very quickly, and this was primarily due to getting body drain from other countries. They were going to a lot of European countries and getting tall and heavy players that they couldn't source from their own population. And so they were causing body drain from European, Australian countries. So as well as reaching into other countries, sports are also going to different ethnic groups. And so they're now seeing more and more black sprinters and Aboriginals in Aussie football. And so one of the interesting and probably positive aspects here is that it's had being good at sport has often been good at breaking down ethnic divisions. I know in the US, whenever there was the first black player to play baseball, Jackie Robinson, it caused a huge conversation, and it led to a whole new era of ethnic relations in the US. I mean, there's still some problems, but it does help break down ethnic divisions. So now we're going to go into a bit more of the physics behind why these parameters actually matter. So the first law of motion is an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and same direction, and unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Now, one part says if you're moving and you're going in a direction, you're going to keep doing that until some other force acts on you, and then you might go change directions. And then the other one is saying you're going to stay still until you have a different one. And so Tim says that this summarizes the diagram. So basically, they're both going to stand there and nothing's going to happen to them until they push off. But then once you do push off, you get that big mass going of the big sumo wrestler. It's going to keep running into the little guy, and there's not much force there, so he's going to keep going. So he's going to get a lot of inertia happening. 1 second.
Was I interrupting you?
Yeah. Okay. So basically, inertia has a lot to do with body size. So when you stay at rest, you're not moving at any speed. So you're 0 meters per second. You don't have any acceleration, and you're just going to stay there. Now, if you're in motion, you're going to be moving, so you're going to be greater than 0. your acceleration is going to be nothing, and you're going to keep going in the same speed and same direction until something stops you. And if it's not enough force, you're just going to keep going. So inertia is the idea of once you get going, you're going to keep doing what you're doing until something stops you. If you think of like a big truck filled with fuel, and it's coming like a road train coming at it, and then it runs into a little toy car, it's going to just crush the toy car, the little kid's car, because it has so much mass behind it. That little force that it hits when it goes there, that big mass, there's so much inertia happening that it's just going to keep going. But if you're at rest, the same thing is there. So if you have a big mass on you, it's going to take you a lot longer to get up to speed than if you have a big truck and you're trying to pull that, it's going to take a long time to get up to 60 miles an hour than if you have a little tiny sports car. You don't have as much mass behind it. You can press on the gas, you'll get there much quicker. So momentum is another property. It's different than inertia, but momentum is mass times velocity. So with increasing mass and velocity, so if you increase mass with velocity, you'll get an increase in inertia. So basically, if you're going downhill and you weigh more, you're gonna have an advantage because you weigh more, and your momentum, you want to keep going at that same speed, and so you do keep going. So another relationship that's interesting is force is mass times acceleration. So if you increase in mass and you keep acceleration constant, so you're increasing the mass and you keep that the same, your force is going to increase, because you increase one of these, it's going to increase the whole relationship. So this is why taller, more massive players have an advantage in that they can produce more force. This is showing just the general plotted relationship of mass times force. So you get a force output maybe in newtons here, and then you get a mass here, and you can just see it's a linear relationship. Force equals mass times acceleration, and they're saying acceleration is constant. So this is why if you're bigger mass, 100 kilos, you're going to probably be able to produce more power, because you can go up here on the scale and you got a bunch more force. Another aspect of that, if you flip the equation around, you get acceleration is equal to force over mass. So if you hold this force constant and mass is increasing, what happens to acceleration? So you increase what you're dividing by, so acceleration will decrease. That's the same analogy of that big truck. You aren't going to be able to accelerate as fast because you have more mass. Once you get up to speed, you're going to have more force, but that comes at a cost of acceleration. You can't get up to speed as quickly. And if you look at that relationship plotted, what you see is it's not linear because you're dividing by it, so you get a bit of a curve to it. But you do see that as you get smaller, you're able to accelerate more. And then as you get more massive, you accelerate less. Now, rotational inertia, radius of gyration, and moment of inertia. These are all things that are important, especially for like racket sports, like tennis or anything that you need to have like an object extended away from your body. And so it's related to rotating bodies. And so I is the rotational inertia, or moment of inertia. M is mass, and R is the radius of gyration. And so basically what you see is your rotational inertia, how willing you are to spin, or able to spin, is related to how massive you are. But more important to that is this r squared. This r squared is important because it's the radius of gyration. It's like the length of that racket. So your arm plus the length of that racket gives you this radius of gyration. And because this is squared, it's going to have a bigger influence on this this rotational inertia. And so increasing your radius of gyration will have a huge influence on your rotational inertia. And this is extremely important in getting a faster tennis serve. You get a taller person, they're able to produce a lot more force on the ball, get higher speeds because of this mechanical advantage, this longer lever that they have, because that relationship is squared compared to the mass. So again, this is just showing a bit more just what I've talked about, that r squared is the radius of the segment, a limb or a bat or a racket. Another one is, this says the exact same thing. K, I guess they just give another letter for radius of gyration. This is the same equation. And so basically you can swing it's just all the same equation. He's talking about having mass proximal, close to the axes of rotation, or distal. So let's say you were going to throw like a shot put or a discus here. So if you have your arm extended all the way out, you can get the whole length. So that would be called distal because it's further away from my center line. So the more distal it is, the further away from your center line it is. Now, if you would hold your arm here and you're throwing distance, it would look kind of ridiculous, yeah? But you would also get a much smaller rotational advantage because you don't have that lever arm. Because if you square that R, you're going to get so much more power on the discus than if you try to flip it like this. So it has a lot to do with that R squared, or for some reason in the case of this one, it's K squared. So the radius of gyration, that r, is a scalar. So it is either, it's a magnitude. It doesn't have a direction. Whereas a vector has a magnitude and direction. And the measurements are kilograms per meter squared. So it's a mass, the kilograms, and meter squared because it's that square relationship there. So a distance. So you got a mass and a distance. If the mass is distributed toward the distal ends, the radius will be greater. So that's what I was just standing up there showing you with the discus. Now, if you put it closer to the proximal end, the gyration will be smaller, and so you get much less advantage. And here you can see the discus throwers. These are professional throwers. And right here, I've actually thrown discus quite a lot. This is a really good position. The girl's turned, she's got her arm fully extended, and they like to call it a pull. If you get your arm back that way, you'll get a lot of pull all down this arm, and you're going to just try to fling that forward. And you can see the guy here too, his whole arm is extended, and you're just trying to get it as far away from your body as possible and then generate power with your legs out. And so they are getting the maximal radius of gyration that they can because this is distal from their body, not proximal. You can say the same with different advantages. So a baseball bat, the longer the racket, the more power you can get. But you also have to be able to handle it correctly. So same with different size tennis rackets, badminton, cricket. So now your vertical height. In any event requiring stature or vertical height, it's an advantage to be taller. So an example is the high jump, where the higher the center of mass and the gravity, the higher advantage you get at this. This is also true for things you need to do like basketball, where you have a goal, or netball, where you're closer to the goal, it makes an advantage. But it's also true for such things as like tennis, like to get more power on your serve, but also in that you have a better view and more angles to hit the ball over the net. So if you're trying to hit over a net at a certain height, the taller you are, the easier it is you have more of the field to play with. This is showing a couple different levels of high jump. So you can see a kid starting at early age. And here's some very tall basketball players and how they've changed from young. And netballers, so they're actually, if you looked at the women's table earlier on, they're the most specialized in terms of height, even compared to at least to the basketball players and the volleyball players that they analyzed. But I imagine basketball and volleyball would be very similar as well, or more. And they're also able to jump, as you can see, which is very nice. So here's the volleyball. They have the advantage of being able to, if they're taller, they have the advantage of being able to hit the ball at more angles on the court. And so they'll have more opportunities to, in this case, kill the ball on the other side. Same for the women. Now here is a very busy slide. It's trying to, this and the next slide is going to try to explain how the high jump, how the height of the athlete helps a high jumper. So if you look at the bottom, in high jumping, the height that an athlete clears may be regarded as the sum of three separate heights. So you get the height of the athlete's center of gravity when they take off. So this height here, height 1. So the height of their center of gravity when they take off. The height the athletes raise their center of gravity during flight. So this H2 up here, it goes to the center. You can't see it, but in your books you should be able to see this, I believe. And then the third height is the difference between the maximum height reached and the center of gravity. So basically what this is saying is how far the high jumpers can clear. So you get the height of your center of gravity plus how much you can make that move by how high you jump, and then how that compares to where the bar height is. So they've shown extremely high correlations of the height of the athlete and what they're able to clear as far as what bar clearance height they can do. And so basically, as you get taller, because you start with this higher center of gravity, you're really going to get a bigger advantage. And so you're seeing high jump athletes get very specialized in that they're very tall, but the other thing they're doing, because they have to jump and they have to transport that mass, they're becoming very slim. Their mass is decreasing so that whenever they push off with the same power, they can go higher. And they also get the advantage of being taller. And so they're optimized in that they're tall and skinny, and they're tall so their center of mass is high, and they're skinny so they don't have to transport as much mass when they jump. And there's a professional guy jumping over. If you compared that to that kid earlier, there's a much better technique, and this arching of the back allows them to get another centimeters, and that's called, is it the Forsberg flop or something flop? Yeah, the Fosbury flop. It's quite a famous thing whenever they started doing that backwards in sports. And it's amazing how the athletes are able to just wrap their body around that bar and keep the same height. So this is going on to the second part of the lecture. This talks about, this will be chapter 4 in your book. It's the somatype. Basically, there's 3 different somatypes, or 3 characteristics that are described when you describe the somatype of a person. There's endomorph, mesomorphy, and ectomorphy. So endo is kind of your more rotund, round person, usually have a bit more fat. Mesomorph is talking about muscularity and the lack of the fat tissue, and ectomorphy is having a higher height to weight ratio. So as you can see, they're tall and elongated, quite skinny. These are quite muscular with little fat, and endomorph are typically larger people, fatter people with more fat tissue and less height. And so people have been trying to classify these things for a long time, like what type of body you are. And Hippocrates even tried to do it in the 5th century BC, and he classified people into 2 different types of systems. And it's just been kind of slowly developed into more and more categories. Well, not more, either 2 to 5 types. But then within these categories, there's just been different ways that they have built on analyzing it. And we're going to talk about how these 3 categories have kind of come to be and how they're like the standard of how people are classifying people as somotypes now. So the somotype is quantified expression or description of the morphological shape of a person. It has 3 numbers that define it. And these numbers, the first one relates to the endomorphy, so the roundness. The second one is the muscular, so the mesomorphy. And the last one is like the tall and skinny, the ectomorph. And so they're just different numbers on that scale. And they're always reported in that same way. So it's endomorphy, mesomorphy, ectomorphy, and they're typically values from 1 to 7. Now, there's a new scale that'll allow the numbers to go higher than 7, but if you see a graph, typically the numbers range from 1 to 7. It is well known by coaches that various body types can be altered over time by intervention programs, such as dietary or strength training regimes. Therefore, the phenotype rating is more realistic criterion in the field of sports science. So basically what this is trying to say is what this is about. This program is how can you intervene with an athlete to try to get them to the best performance. And this is saying that you can actually change an athlete's body composition according to this somotype classification system. You can get a person more mesomorphic by getting more strength training. You can get a person less endomorphic, so round, if you get them to have a lower calorie diet and to do endurance training. So you can change a person's somotype to fit the sport that they want. So this is, again, going back to the optimization of sport. You can make the body of the athlete more closely resemble what the optimization is of that sport. I mean, you can't change, well, you can, but it's not typical. You can't really change height, but you can change the mass and you can change the balance between the fat and the muscle content in order to optimize for that particular sport. In general, mesomorphs are well-defined muscles with large bones. Men tend to be rectangular and women have more of an hourglass, where ectomorphs are slim or to very slim and with very light muscles. And endomorphs are round shaped with short limbs, small hands and feet. I mean, the thing about this category is that a person is a combination of all 3 body types. So we'll talk about kind of ways to measure this, and so you can figure out where you do fall on this scale. Again, this shows a couple examples of the endomorph, the mesomorph, and the ectomorph body shape. And this is a more extreme example showing the muscular version of that. So here you can see the 1 to 7 scale. This is how in the book you get a lot of diagrams that show this kind of triangular shaped graph where 1, 7, 1 would be a full-on mesomorph, like complete muscular personality with very similar endomorph to ectomorph ranges, where endomorph down here, you're going to be quite round with little musculature in ectomorph. So this is how, if you put the numbers on the scale, if you go for 444, you'll be right in the center of the graph, and then you kind of just plot where you would fall otherwise. The interesting thing about these plots, and the only thing I find quite useful about them, is that you can see distinctly where different types of athletes fall, like the optimized version. So weightlifters, they're extremely mesomorphic because they need a bunch of power. You don't want to be too tall, and you don't want to be too fat. And so they fall quite high. They fall a little more on the endomorph. They have a little bit more mass compared to height. They're shorter, but they're extremely high in muscle, whereas sumo wrestlers, compared to weightlifters, are going to have a lot more fat tissue, and so they fall more on the endomorphic range, but they also higher than the 4 because they're strong. For sprinters, you don't want adipose tissue, you don't want fat, because it'll just slow you down, it doesn't help you get there faster. So they're more ectomorph, but high mesomorphic. So they have a lot of muscle, and they're more on the slim line than on excess fat. Tennis players go more towards the middle. They might have a little bit more fat, but they're just not as tall. They're just kind of a bit more towards the general population. In high jumpers, here's where you can see that drop in the mass. You get very tall and skinny people in high jump. So they're getting more towards the ectomorph. But because athletes, what you notice is they're all, see this 4 line? Almost all the professional athletes will fall in the mesomorphic range. So the most important characteristic of endomorph, ectomorph, mesomorph, the most common feature is that you have muscular structure. And so you need to fall in the mesomorphic range. We just talked about this. One of the added one they have here is footballers. They fall very symmetrically between endomorph and ectomorph. But they are just lean and strong individuals, and so they go more towards the mesomorph. They're not necessarily tall or fat. Extremely busy slide. This is in your book. It shows you how you can actually calculate your somotype. Basically, so you can't read it, but this is endomorphy. So how you get your endomorphy rating is you take skin fold measurements at your triceps, so in your upper arm behind it, at your subscapular, so on your back where your shoulder blade is, and at your hip bone. And so you take the skin fold measurements at those 3 levels, you add them up and you put them in this formula and you get a number, and then you circle over here, and then you wind up with an endomorphy range. So basically, endomorphy from this scale is based completely on skin fold measurements. Now, if you go to mesomorphy, which has been told to be like the most important for your somotype as far as an athlete goes, it's based off of, you can see here, your height, or you can't see here, then your humerus width. So the width of your arm bone, and then your femur width, which is your width of your leg bone. And also it measures the girth of your biceps. So like if you would put a piece of rope around your biceps, how long that rope would be. And then also your calf girth. So the biceps and the calf girth give a feel for how much muscle mass you have. The bones give you a bit more of your kind of structure of your body, and the height also. And so it kind of gives you an idea. It doesn't take into any skin fold measurements. It's just kind of how muscular you are and what's your stature like. And then on the bottom, the ectomorphy, the last one. We'll go back to mesomorphy. You enter all these values, you put them in over here, and then there's a really weird way of calculating the formula. So you get your height, let's say you're 174 and you draw a line, and then you measure your different parameters. and you add up the distance you are from your height on there, and you divide it by 8 and multiply by 4. It's a really weird formula to get your mesomorphy scale. But you can see it in the book. It's a bit hard to figure out, but it's kind of interesting. And so then the last somotype is your ectomorphy. And so it's almost like your BMI, but not quite. It takes your body mass, and then it takes your height. And so it gives you a formula. It's like your height divided by the square root of your body mass. And you get a value here. So then you take those 3 values that you get if you're trying to measure an individual, and you put it on here. And if somebody's a 444, they fall right in the middle. If they're higher on you can just find where the numbers are. Okay, so you're 361, you fall right up here. 271, this would be kind of where weightlifters often fall. So low on they have a little bit more endomorphy, a little more fat, but they're really high on the muscle and structure content. And then ectomorphy is about the height again. And you can just, once you take this information, in the end you'll get which number, so like a 5, a 3, and a 4. You go over here and you find 5, 3, and 4. So 5, so then you got to kind of figure out where it goes, 5, 3, 4. So they would be down here. So it's kind of a search and find. But if an athlete was a 5, 3, 4, I think this diagram is just useful to track the progress of an athlete, give them something to motivate for, be like, hey, look, you want to be up in this area, and you're down here, so let's put in a weight training program and a dietary thing. So it's kind of convoluted, but it gives a very good visual overview of where you fall. And if you can show them this compared to where they want to be for the optimized person, it would be a good tool for them to kind of follow up on. Now here are just some general somotypes for different sports people. Rowing one is fairly interesting in that actually all of them you can see the middle number, the 5.5s, the 5, that's quite high in the mesomorphy, and low in the 2 point something is lower than normal, and ectomorphy. Here, rowing has higher. So if you look at 3.4, rowers are going to be taller than the water polo people. And lightweight rowers, they are taller, and they have, they're not as massive, so they don't have as much mesomorphy when you compare them to open rowers. So it's just, you can see the changes in body type as you go. And down here, this is a very interesting one, a 5, 9.5. So the weightlifter down here has quite a bit endomorphy, but extremely high mesomorphy. So he has all the muscles to lift the weights and very little ectomorphy, because the taller you are, the harder it is to lift those weights. You have to get more. So you want to be small and very muscular, and that's exactly what this somotype shows. Here you can go on, and the book goes into detail about how the different types of running, the different marathoners, how the body types change with the different athletes. And we talked about this earlier in the optimization part. And again, it shows you a difference in rugby players. You can use this scale to also see the difference between forwards and backs, where the forwards have more muscles and are a bit more endomorphic, so rounder and stronger, where the backs need to run a bit faster, so they're a bit leaner but still strong and a bit taller. So you can just, these are good ways to kind of visually see how all the different athletes might compare. Then you get to basketball and netball. They have very similar, in volleyball, you want to be tall and can jump, fairly muscular. So it's not surprising that they all have very similar breakdowns in their body types. And you can see boxing has quite a distinct mesomorphic with little body fat, and depending on the category, how tall they are. So going into running, sprinters are tall and muscular with slim yet powerful legs. They are ectomesomorphic. So ectomesomorphic. So ecto, that they're tall, and mesomorphic because they have the muscular structure. And they need a bunch of fast twitch muscle fiber, so they get a very powerful burst of speed, but then when they finish the race, they're exhausted because they don't dissipate that energy very well. Whereas long distance marathon runners, they're smaller and lighter. They must have a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers, and they're built for endurance and dissipating heat. They will need strict training to allow their muscles to store up high reserves of glycogen, and it's the fuel that keeps them able to withstand dehydration. So again, going back to this picture, these athletes are highly specialized for the event that they're running. And so it's just showing you that even though your perception might be that they're unhealthy, but for performance, they are optimized. For health, you can sometimes even get too little body fat and it can be a problem. But as far as performance, they are fully optimized. Swimming like Ian Thorpe, he was the perfect swimmer with tall, long arms, and he had large feet and hands that help propel him in the water. The short distance swimmers tend to be more mesomorphic, so muscular in structure with the fast twitch muscles, quite like short distance swimmers and short distance runners need to be highly mesomorphic. So it gives them the burst of speed. And this is showing Thorpe swimming in the 200, 400, 800. Torpedo, I think, is his nickname. And then Callis in the 50 and the 100. And then here's Sullivan. He went into the record books for the 50 and 100. So he's a very good sprinter. And you can see in his structure, very lean, quite tall, got good hands. So he has the body type that you would expect to be good in the water and very fast. And here's showing his world records and what date they occurred. Rowers tend to be tall and also heavy, but very low body fat. They're tall because you want long limbs to give a mechanical advantage, and they need to have a lot of aerobatic fitness. So they need to be able to have good lung capacity and heart capacity. They can take in 300 liters of air each minute, which is way above normal. Shooting, you don't typically think that you need to be in shape to shoot, but it's extremely good to be cardiovascular fit, because if you can lower your heart rate while you're shooting, you have a better chance of a steady shot. In pistols, you also need to have stability in your upper arm to be able to withstand the kickback. So gymnasts need to be small and slim, and women also typically it's gone to younger and younger women. So prior to, and men it hasn't gone as much to the younger age, but women are very young now for professional gymnasts. Their body need to be strong and narrow to allow for the different moves. They need to be extremely flexible, so their muscles have to be bendable as well as powerful. And they're often considered to be the fittest of all athletes. Weightlifting, generally you want, I would not even say average, you want a short person with short arms and legs, and extremely mesomorphic, lots of muscle mass. You need a bunch of fast twitch muscle fibers and intense bursts of energy to get the weight where you want it. So in general, you have an ideal body composition that varies quite a bit differently between sports, but in general, you want less fat mass. Then you'll have a better performance, and then you can divide your body into fat-free part and the part that has fat. The fat-free mass is comprised of muscle tissue, which does most of the work, and it also has bone. But the body composition refers to the percentage of muscle you have, the fat you have, the bone, and then the other organs in your body. The average male Olympic cross-country skier is 25-year-old, 178 centimeters tall, 75 kilograms, and 5% body fat. And if you look at that compared to women, you get a bit shorter and a bit lower weight, but more body fat because women have a higher percentage of body fat than men in the population. So this is a figure that shows that for all the different sports. So men always have a lower percentage body fat than women. So success of an athlete can depend a lot on the body type. So you can try to get your body type to more closely match to optimize size. But body fat is something you want to try to reduce. It doesn't help in very many sports. It contributes no strength advantage. It limits your endurance and speed and movement through space. So there's not very many things where body fat can be helpful. So it's one of the first things people target to decrease to help an athlete perform. So there are advantages to the appropriate amount of fat, and this would be shock absorption, especially in like American football or rugby, buoyancy in swimming, thermal insulation in swimming, because if you're swimming for a long time in cold water, if you get too cold, you won't be able to perform well. And it also stores fuel, especially in longer things like cross-country skiing. But this says advantages of appropriate amounts. You don't want too much, and there are papers out there to kind of talk to you about what levels you want. And the fat mass changes between sports. So basketball, you can be fatter than you can't and not affect your performance compared to cross-country skiing. So you don't need as much endurance in basketball as you do in cross-country skiing or marathoning. But golf, you don't need much endurance, so you can also be able to have a bit more fat without as much affecting your performance level. So the fat levels are dependent on what sport you are in. Now, training correctly can increase your muscle mass. So good nutrition can correct exercise can really change your body composition. And this is why it's important to kind of know about these different things. You can then try to use these as tools to motivate athletes to try to get them to a different type of body to match the type they want to be in. And in general, you only want essential fat, not non-essential fat. This is being repeated. Overfat is more important than overweight in determining the health and wellness. BMI is a good indicator if you're over fat, but it actually doesn't directly measure fat. It just does a height and weight ratio. So heavyweight boxers are extremely overweight if you look at their BMI, even though they might have a 5% muscle mass or body fat. So it's not the definite way to do body fat measurements. There's some tools out there, impedance measurements, that you can do to actually get fat. So essential fat is like a bicyclist. They have some that help you run. If you don't have enough fat, your heart actually gets overworked and you have different problems. I forgot what they are right now. But if you sumo wrestlers have a bunch of non-essential fat, but they do help with the impact and increase their mass. So you do need some fat, but you want to kind of optimize it to what sport you're doing. This is just, again, a summary of mesomorphs being well-defined, large bones, rectangular, and ectomorphs being slim to very slim, lightly muscled, endomorphs being round body shape, short limbs. You are a combination of all three, and you got to try to figure out where you want to go with that. And so that would be the end of the lecture.